Everyone, this is Danny. And here today, what we're going to be talking about is activation architecture. This is where we start to move beyond all the data modeling, the data ingestion, and start to get into how do we activate on all this information and these profiles. So today we're going to be going over the audiences and segments, segment evaluation, as well as the destination, personalizing on the edge, as well as some of the labs that we'll be doing about the edge and the destinations. For audience segments, what we have here is something I want to make sure everyone understands because a lot of people, when they get to this step, are making certain assumptions that I want to clarify. So we started off with the ingest methods at the beginning where we had modeled everything and now we ingested, and you have these different speeds with which you can ingest. After ingestion comes the evaluation method. So at this point, what we have is we've defined all our rules, whatever they might be. We've ingested whatever data is, and we need to evaluate. These evaluation methods are also available at 3 different speeds: edge, streaming, and batch. Finally, what we have are the activation methods. And the activation methods really are saying I have 3 different speeds, again, edge, streaming, and batch, by which I can activate or do something with the profile now that it has been ingested, now that we've run certain rules against it and understand which audiences they are a part of, and finally, what do I do with it? What's critical to understand here is that the downstream steps, such as activation, is reliant upon upstream steps having been completed. So while we can mix and match each of these approaches, it does not speed up the previous step. So I cannot take a batch ingest, right, and speed it up because I said I wanted a streaming activation method. So keep these 3 steps in mind as we go through this entire exercise. So some important terminology to keep in mind is sometimes you'll hear me mix and match segment and audience wording. And that's because really what we have going on here is we have a segment definition, which is really a set of rules. Then we have the actual segmentation, which is the process by which we apply these rules. And out of that comes an audience. And the audience really is the result of having applied these rules to profiles and getting a set of profiles that actually qualify for these rules that we've defined. So in the audience portal, what we have is an area where all the rules of, all the audiences that are built and inside a platform can be seen here. And you'll see this grow over time as we add more and more to it. There are 3 ways in which we create audiences inside of platform. One is something that's externally sourced. A second is where it's internally composed. And a third is where it's internally defined. And we're going to dive into each one of these, but at a high level, we have these 3 options. Now, for an externally sourced audience, what we're saying here is that I have something that's been defined externally. In other words, the rules themselves have been defined and evaluated external to platform. Now I'm going to take the results of that and I'm going to load it into platform such that I can say that this person or profile had qualified for this externally, and now I'm just telling you whether or not they are in or out of that audience. And we provide 2 mechanisms for doing this. One is the external audiences or file upload, essentially, where I've done that and I'm just handing a list of people who qualify for an audience. Another mechanism is where I have a federated access. And this is a little different in that what we do is we allow for the capability on saying, I have this external definition or external rules, and I'm reaching out and saying, give me this information, and I will store the result on side of platform. So one is more of a file-based, one is more still a rules-based, but those rules are executed externally, not inside of platform, and just the results are put in platform on the profile itself. For an internally composed audience, this is where what we are doing is saying, I have a segment that's our audience that's already been defined, and I have the result that's been stored on top of a profile. What I'm going to do is I'm going to reach in and I'm going to put some additional rules or criteria on top of that, doing things such as looking at attributes of the profile and or even doing things such as splits and ranks and things like that that allow me to then turn around and store additional audiences depending on the rules that I define inside this composer. And then lastly, what we have is internally defined. For an internally defined audience, what we're saying here is I'm going to look at the raw profile itself. And I'm going to apply merge policies. And these merge policies will bring together all the components or fragments of profile that then are used in these rules that I'm going to define inside of platform. So this then takes the result, evaluates those, and stores it on top of profile such that now I can reevaluate those on an ongoing basis. Again, using profile both as my source and then storing it also onto profile after the evaluation. So what is Segment Builder? Segment Builder basically has a UI that allows us to build out these various rules. But as part of those rules, one of the things we have to define is the evaluation method. So that method is evaluated in 3 different ways, as you saw earlier: edge, speed, streaming speed, and batch speed. When we look at the edge speed and how it behaves is a little different for each one of these. So edge, what it's looking at is ensuring that, do I have data coming in to the edge? When I do, I am going to evaluate in real time against that payload or event that comes into the edge. And it only evaluates against those audiences that have been defined as edge evaluation and are sitting on the edge. The difference between that and streaming is streaming ingest also is triggered by real-time events that are flowing in, but these have to be on the hub. And so all the information that comes in real time to the hub then will kick off, as long as it's streaming ingest, as the data flows in. And this is in a near real-time fashion. And it will evaluate both for audiences that are defined as having a streaming evaluation, as well as those that are defined as edge evaluation. So both edge and streaming will evaluate as streaming on hub. And lastly, we have batch. So batch evaluation is a little different. Whereas edge and streaming are evaluating as data flows in, batch evaluation is saying on a daily basis, I'm going to evaluate. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to evaluate against all data, meaning any data that's been ingested in batch or streaming, whether it came into the edge or onto the hub. And so what this does is it allows you to evaluate the most complex rules against all the definitions, regardless of how they're stored. And this allows for a lot of flexibility in trying to tackle the use case that is appropriate for what you're trying to do. Segment builders, terms and definitions. Throughout this area, what we've been talking about are traits and behaviors. When we start to log into the UI, things are defined just slightly differently, and you should be aware that traits, what we're really referring to, are attributes of the profile. Behaviors are events that are coming in. And in the JSON object itself, you'll see something called segment membership. And when you look in the UI, you'll see something called audiences. And so this is just a simple thing to be aware of when you're in the UI. So when we're looking at attributes within Segment Builder of a profile, what we're really talking about is being able to take any of these attributes, such as where somebody lives, right? Or something along the lines of maybe all the different licenses they own, depending on what they're trying to do. Each of these has a data type associated with that. And when you bring that data type onto the segment builder, we will interpret that and try to say if it's a string, we'll make things available such as contains, starts with, whereas if it's a numeric data type, we'll say greater than or less than, right? And each one of those dates and timestamps will have the ability to say right before or after. So all of that is made available here in the segment builder. We also allow complex statements such as nesting, anding, or, and include and exclude and things like that. So a lot of that is made available here in the UI. From an event perspective, it's a little bit different than the attributes. Events are interesting in that we store all our events with something called a timestamp. That timestamp allows us to do interesting things such as sequential segments that we'll get into later. But it also has certain things like an event type. And so you can have that information used here as we define out these rules. Each of these rules will also do the same thing as the attributes in that it will look at the field that we're going to use or filter on and use the appropriate data type. But it also allows us to do things like aggregation in some scenarios where I can do things like sum, average, min, max. I can count certain things to say I have at least 2 of these. And it allows me also to say, right, this must happen before that or within a certain time frame. In addition, this also has and or complex definitions that we can take advantage of, and we'll get into that more as you see the UI. From an audience building perspective, I can now take audiences and use them within other audiences to say things such as, well, I might have a VIP segment where I've defined all the rules for a VIP and then store that result on profile. When I do that, I can then turn around and use that result for other audiences and other segment rules to say, okay, take this and utilize it to say things like, oh, they must have been in the VIP audience, and then apply additional rules, whatever those might be. And again, we provide the same complex statement capabilities and or things like that, include, exclude. Dimensional entities were something that we introduced early on around ways to model our data. We showcased how certain things, like in this case, a product lookup, we may want to store differently, outside the main entity of things like orders in this example. Where we said that we would get to use those is in our segment building rules. So here you can see that as we did a relationship between SKU and the lookup here, I am now able to utilize that information in Segment Builder. That allows for certain things, but one of the things that it mostly allows for is updating the data without having to update all the profiles themselves. Or in this case with an order, right, it's an immutable event, and so I cannot update it. So I must use a lookup table in order to accommodate that. When we do that, there's going to be some trade-offs. The biggest one to be aware of is that it's going to evaluate those audiences or segment rules as batch. And that's something you just kind of need to be aware of. And there are ways to deal with that in terms of denormalization that we covered as part of the earlier constructs, or the instructions. So in the segment builder, one of the things that you can see on the gear icon here in the UI is if you click on that, it's going to showcase 2 options by which it shows which fields you can create rules based on. By default, it has this first one selected here, which is show only the fields with data. This is what we call the observable schema. So if I were building something based off of that, I would see only these 3 fields in this example because I had only populated 3 fields with data. Now, when I look at the actual schema though, I will notice that I have many more. And the reason is I haven't populated the rest of those with data. So if I ever need to utilize one versus the other, I can toggle between them to say, show me all the fields or just the fields with data. And by default, like I said, we only show the ones with data, but here's how you change that. So let's go through a little bit about how the segment evaluation and destinations work within a data flow so that you can kind of wrap your head around this. So segment evaluation when it comes to the edge. So as we go through this, data comes in, let's say, first to the edge network. When we do this, what we're going to see is the first thing that makes available is I can send that out through event forwarding to a third party or even to an Adobe solution if need be. Another thing that happens is the edge evaluation happens at this point. The event has come in. I would kick off any edge evaluation rules, making those available to the third party and or even target themselves if they're utilizing that information. Lastly, I would respond back to the client with whatever personalization request has happened or any content or information that it needs back to the client. For streaming evaluation, what we're looking at here is data may come in through the edge, but it also can be streamed in to the hub. Both of these eventually end up on the pipeline. Pipeline then kicks off any kind of streaming evaluation based on the event that just got sent in. That will also record whether or not they qualified for the appropriate streaming audiences and put the result back onto pipeline. From there, destinations may fire off to say this person qualified for this audience, send it out to this destination, or journeys may be listening to certain criteria around a segment qualification. Lastly, it may be sending that data back up to, or qualification back up to the edge network saying this profile now qualified for this audience, make it available on the edge. For a batch evaluation, things happen a little differently. First off, data may come in from any one of these sources. For the streaming sources, it will be happening all day long where it's sending all this information in. Now, batch data may also be loading all day long, but nothing happens in terms of evaluation just yet. What happens is we wait for the scheduler to kick off the batch evaluation. When it does that, it's going to look at all the data that came in through any source and do its evaluation for all the audiences. As a result, it's going to put that information back onto profile. And then finally, it makes it available, depending on how the destinations are set up, either to the real-time CDP destinations for sending out, or it may also kick off a journey that was listening for a qualification to happen. Then it will send that information back up to the edge network, making it available on the edge if that was one of the destinations. So let's talk about some of these destination connectors we've been going through. So destination types roughly break down into two. We've got streaming and batch. Now for each one of these destination connectors, they roughly break down into two types, as I like to go through. One is more of a marketing oriented one is more of a technical oriented one. And so for the streaming marketing ones, these are kind of ones where we're looking at things like social or some kind of personalization or mobile, where I need to stream something out in relative real time out to one of these destinations. Whereas from a technical source, I might say, well, I have to stream some of this data out, but it's for maybe a business integration, or sorry, a technical integration to a system. And so I might use something like an HTTP API or cloud storage that's listening for a streaming pipeline to populate the data. Whereas from a batch source, our destination connector, I would use more the identity partners or email when it comes to a marketing use case or reason for that connector to be listening. And that would send something more in a batch and blast style situation. Whereas with the technical ones, I might have just a generic S3 bucket or a data landing zone that Adobe provides sitting there waiting for files to arrive. And these are probably more integrated with, again, a technical solution. Now for an activation, what we're seeing also is what gets sent where. And what we mean by that is when we look at the edge itself, the edge makes available, when data is sent in to it, it makes available profile data to target, to custom personalization, to web SDK. All of these basically can see the profile on the edge. Now, from a hub perspective, destinations itself can see the profile as it qualifies for various audiences, and then can turn around and send this information out to these destinations, again, having access to the profile and its various attributes. So Journey Optimizer also can read from the profile data as it sees it. This is in contrast to event type data. Now, event type data, when it comes into the edge, what we do is we can turn around and forward this event data out. But what we can't do is read from the profile before sending that event data out. So event forwarding only can see event data. Whereas on the flip side, when we look at Adobe Target and the third-party personalization, it has access to the profile data. So the two of these really have exposure to two different types of data. And a lot of people mix and merge these things and then realize that there's a bit of a scope line there. The unique thing about a Journey Optimizer from the hub is that it can see some of the event data when it's listening for certain kind of event triggers to trigger or kick off a journey that might do something. So it's a little unique in that perspective as well. So streaming destinations, let's take a look at this. So streaming destinations really are saying that I have these triggers here. And those triggers are saying I need to kick off a export. And I'm going to send that downstream somewhere. And what triggers that are things like the audience membership updates, the identity map updates, anything you see on the left-hand side here. Now, when that kicks off, we're going to get about a 5-minute latency for it to do its processing before it sends it out. Now, when it does, it's going to send this information out to these different exports. Destinations, again, one being the social advertising ones, and one is more the system integration ones. The key difference here is the identities only will go to the social one, whereas identities and attributes can go to things more like HTTP API integrations. Now, if we're doing file-based or batch exports, things are a little different in this regard. So this is kicking off more of a schedule. So on the schedule, it's not necessarily listening for things like segment or audience qualification, but it will kick off this job on a periodic basis. It will also kick off this job after the segment batch job has run or on demand. The thing to be aware of, though, is this will run right on the scheduled every 3, 6, 8, 12 hours in terms of its schedule. Now, when it sends out, it's going to be sending out either for an incremental, it'll send out the profile identities, the required attributes and segment membership changes. Whereas if I'm sending a full file upload, I'm going to send all the profile identities and required attributes. So there's a little bit different between these two pieces here that we have to keep in mind. So now we're going to walk through an example. The example will be personalization on the edge. And what this is a couple of different things to go through. One is, what is the edge network in terms of an architecture? A hub architecture is probably where we should start. The hub architecture basically says is, for one, I have kind of a centralized place for my application services and my data. And what it is I have all these clients and services and devices out there that are accessing this application and its data from a centralized location. And what this does is it puts two things on here. One is physical distance is large. in some scenarios and shorter in others. So you get inconsistent timing in terms of access patterns. The other thing you get is a kind of centralized point of everything having to execute on one area. And so it doesn't allow, it creates a bottleneck in a sense. Now, from an edge architecture standpoint, what we're doing is trying to address two of those things. One is if we create an edge server that is globally distributed, the physical distance for one decreases for each of these devices. The other thing is the number of devices and services that are accessing any one edge is much smaller than the sum of all of them accessing the hub architecture. So this allows for solving two problems. Now, when you use Adobe's Edge network, one of the things we allow is how do you get the data in? So web SDK, mobile SDK, and we provide a server-side API mechanism. All of them allow for integration back and forth from our Edge network. Now, the Edge network makes that data available to a lot of the Adobe solutions, and you would specify that and how you integrate with the Edge network and what you're sending in and where you want to send it. The other thing we allow for is the event forwarding I spoke of earlier. Event forwarding does allow for us to send to a lot of non-Adobe solutions for your purposes. And so this allows a lot of very interesting use cases for how you can tap into the Adobe Edge network. Here what we have is a blueprint. So this blueprint is available out on Experience League, and this specific one is around the Edge implementation with the mobile SDK, web and mobile SDK. And while it's got all the numbers, the lettering and numbering is a little small here, so I prefer a different way of looking at things that is more of a sequence than this one. So here we have personalization on the edge. And we have the different actors across the top here in red boxes, and we're going to show how the data and calls integrate with each one of these things. So let's start with nothing in platform, and we're going to load it with some customer data. So the first thing we do is we load some data. It comes in, it lands on profile, eventually segmentation, batch or streaming kicks off, and the qualification lands back on profile. From there, we're going to push back up to the edge, if anything's out there, to update it based on what we just did. So some things to note is there's no pre-population of profiles on the edge at this point. It only updates if something's already there. Only segments that are configured for the edge are actually pushed out to the edge. And something to note, the time to live on the edge is 14 days. The next thing that happens is the client device is going to send in a request. This request will be a collection request. An interact request. An interact request says, I'm expecting some kind of response back from the edge. So the call comes in to the edge network. It's going to say, okay, I have this, send the event itself down to the hub to start with. And that will kick off any kind of data ingest on the hub. At the same time, it's going to ingest that data into and create a profile on the edge. The edge will then kick off any kind of edge segmentation evaluation and store the result on profile. From there, it's going to respond back to the edge network. The edge network then needs to tell target and audience offer decisioning, basically that we have a interact call here. And here's the primary identity by which we are interacting with. From there, the request is made to say, give me the profile, and it responds with the profile. From there, target will do its kind of experience qualification to say, based on this profile, what do they qualify for that experience? Then that response will be handed back to the edge network, which in turn gets handed back finally to the originating device that made the call. Now, on the back end, if you see up above, we made a call here to say, get me this profile if it's missing on the edge. And what this is saying is that if I don't have the information on the edge because the time to live expired, or it's the first time I'm creating it, go get it from the hub. Eventually, it will return the profile to the hub, but that is an async call. It is not going to hold up the web page waiting for that profile to come back from the edge. So a couple things to note. The edge evaluation will also run as streaming on the hub. So even though the edge is evaluating the hit as it comes in, it will also evaluate that same piece on the hub, because remember, there may be additional data here on the hub that doesn't exist on the edge, because we are ingesting data both to the edge and to the hub, so the same rule may result in two different qualification answers. The edge profile is not pushed to the hub. This surprises some people. They expect that there's an edge profile that's pushing down to the hub, and it's not. It's always the other direction. And this, again, is because there's more data sitting down on the hub than on the edge. Target and offer decisionings will fetch a real-time profile from the edge. And so that allows them much faster real-time response. The edge profile is also updated from the hub asynchronously, like I mentioned earlier. It's not going to be holding up the web page. So now a web page is loaded. We want to see what happens when I click on it. So I click on it and I interact with it in some way. Again, a call is going to come into the edge network. From there, it's going to follow a very similar pattern in terms of an event will go through and do its edge segmentation and evaluation. That same event will notify target so it can do its piece in terms of its qualification. At the same time, the event goes down to the profile in order to kick off any kind of streaming or edge evaluation on the hub. Eventually, what we're going to get back is all the identity resolution that may have been sent in that requires new matching will be sent back out to the edge, updating it, saying that we have two identities that might be related with each other. And lastly, based on whatever qualifications have happened on the segments, we'll project those back out to the edge as well. So we're constantly going through this cycle of every single click, both creating something on the edge, kicking off edge segmentation, doing any kind of edge evaluation with whatever experience engine. All that data comes down to the hub. It goes through its evaluation. It goes through its updating of profile. It goes through its identity resolution, linking any kind of new relationship between identities. All that then gets projected back out to the edge for what's needed, and then we have a refreshed or more in sync profile on the edge with what's on the hub. The identity graph is updated on the hub. Nothing happens in terms of identity graph resolution on the edge. So that's something to keep in mind, that has to be a round trip that happens down to the hub instead of happening on the edge. Another thing is that the profile merge is then projected to the edge. So when we have these profile merge policies that get created, one of the things we have to remember is that these profile merge policies, one of them defines what gets to the edge, and that will be what's projected. We don't project all the profile merge possibilities out to the edge, just the one. All right. For the lab that's going to be done, what we do is we start with building a segment that's an edge segment. The reason we're going to do this is we want to see what happens when we send data into the edge. So we're going to create an edge segment. Then what we'll do is we'll go out and create a event forwarding property and set up event forwarding with a data stream. Next, we're going to set up a AEP data stream that actually writes both out to the event forwarding, but also writes down to the hub saying where to store that data on the hub. Then we're going to send in an event request and view the response that happens when we hit the edge and how it includes the edge segment as part of that evaluation criteria. Lastly, we'll see that segment criteria on the hub to say whether they do or don't qualify for edge speed, and see what happens when we view and don't view the hub versus the edge profile.